But this is what we're going to start with. So we're now in Aristotle's Nichomachean Ethics, Book 3, and we're looking at the question of responsibility and choice and character, right? Because part of what we have to be concerned with in ethics is what are we actually responsible for? You know, some people would say you're responsible for everything. Let me close this up because there's a good noise. Some would say that you're not responsible for anything, right? And you know people that make excuses. Everybody gets off the hook. There's a reason for everybody to do what they did. Nobody, meant for things to turn out this sort of way when bad things happen. You've all heard this sort of thing before, right? And what I'd like you to think about is the difference between these two ways that you see very often in the media when some event takes place, whether it's economic or environmental or political or who knows what, managing protests or policing or things like that. People will say stuff like this: mistakes were made, right? Bad things happened. More rarely these days they will say, I or we made mistakes. What's the difference? Yeah.
The I or we made mistakes, you're actually taking responsibility for it. Mistakes were made, you're just saying, all right, a mistake was made, but there's nothing we could have done about it.
Yeah, that's probably a good way to put it. A mistake was made. We're really sorry about it. I'm sorry that mistakes were made. It's not actually saying I'm sorry that I did something wrong. And people will do this. They'll say these sorts of things even about personal matters. So think about celebrities that have gotten in trouble, over the last 5-10 years in your experience. Ask yourself, did they actually say something like this when they were doing their mea culpa? Mea culpa means it's my fault, right? In Latin. Or did they say something like this? I really, regret the bad effects my actions had. Is that the same thing as saying my actions were bad and I regret doing them? Those are, different ways of arranging the language, right? But they actually do seem to mean different things. They convey different positions in ethics. You probably, this is kind of a side note, this isn't something that Aristotle's saying, but if you think about this, if you are around people who say this sort of thing, you should probably watch them very carefully. Because people who say this sort of thing routinely are much less likely to be responsible than people who say this sort of thing, aren't they? What else do people say when something bad happened? Something bad took place. Somebody did something wrong. What are other sorts of things that people say? You guys all have experience of this. Because you said it yourself, and you've had many other people say these things to you. What are common things people say? Yeah.
That's how things are.
That's how things are. Oh, that's a good one. That's how things are. And sometimes they'll say something like, suck it up. Get yourself up off the ground and dust yourself off, because life is not fair. Yeah.
One that I hate the most is, it is what it is.
That's very similar to this. It is what it is. I can think of another one that I hear people say.
A lot of my friends say, it be like that sometimes.
Okay. That's almost...
Yeah, it's like the same thing.
And then sometimes people will try to cover it up and say it's all for the best. Is that consoling? Didn't turn out your way this time, but it's all going to work out for the best. Yeah. Go ahead.
Everything happens for a reason.
Yeah, that's along the same sort of lines. Yeah, and sometimes the reason is somebody's a jerk and they did the wrong thing, isn't it? Right? Or a reason. Well, how do people try to get out of responsibility? I didn't mean it, right?
It's not my fault.
Yeah. I didn't mean for this to happen. Usually it's not my fault is coupled with something like this. Another way of doing it is to say, it's someone else's fault.
Or it's out of my control.
Okay, yeah, that's good too. It's out of my control. Put that in with. Well, it's not always involving blaming somebody else. Let's see. College, right?
Yeah.
It's out of my control. Okay, out of my control. There's actually a. Have any of you guys ever seen this movie Dangerous Liaisons? It was based on a book. Came out back, it was in the 90s, back when Glenn Close was, still sort of a hot starlet, and who was the guy? John Malkovich was the lead, and Michelle Pfeiffer was in it. And he's a gigolo in France, and he seduces Michelle Pfeiffer to get in good with the woman that he actually does care about, who is Glenn Close, who's really conniving and manipulative. Actually, they both are. He seduces Michelle Pfeiffer, who's married, and then gets her to fall in love with him, and then he breaks it off with her. He actually does fall in love with her, but Glenn Close makes him break it off. And the way that he breaks it off, he has this refrain that he says over and over again. He doesn't say it's out of my control. What does he say? Something very similar. I can't remember the exact line, but it's something along those lines. As if, again, bad things happen, but who's responsible? So these are the sort of things that people will say when they want to get out of responsibility, right? So you're all familiar with this. You've probably said some of these at one point in time when you probably shouldn't have, and you've had this said to you a lot, and you're going to have the rest of your life. Do people say stuff like this when good things happen?
No.
Does anybody say, successes occurred? No, they take credit for it, don't they? They say, yeah, I was instrumental to that success. My planning, my idea, et cetera, et cetera. That's how things are. Does anybody say, yeah, that's how things are. Our company just, automatically produces successful things. Our students automatically learn things. They take credit for it again, don't they? I didn't mean for this to happen. When it turns out good, though, I did mean for this to happen. This is exactly what I had in mind. It's someone else's fault. There are some people who actually have trouble taking credit for things, and they will pass the credit off on other people, yeah.
Wouldn't I didn't mean for this to happen actually be true because nobody plans for there to be a failure, but they try to plan for success? So if something is successful, they didn't mean for it to happen, but if it turns out...
Yeah, you're right. On one level it's true, but it's not, we're going to see this as we look through Aristotle, it's not really a sufficient way of addressing the issue, yeah.
I was just gonna say, how about destiny? It could take role on both points.
Yeah. Sometimes people will attribute their successes to fate, destiny, God, things like that. More rarely than their failures. But you're right, some people do.
I was going to say, I had a boss who emphasized that even if you're not responsible for something, if you take responsibility, you'll actually gain more leadership rather than say, okay, it's not.
You mean for good things or for bad things?
Well, for good and bad things.
I mean, if you
sometimes.
didn't
Like
do
if
it-
you could say no, but if you could say,
Yeah.
oh, mistakes were made, then if you're a leader, you'll say, oh, you know, I'm sorry, I'll try better next time, rather than saying, oh, well, you know, it's just meant to be.
Yeah, I mean,
But
you
of
could,
course, if it's someone else's mistake, you know, you just say, hey, you know, this person messed up.
yeah, I mean, you could say something like, it happened on my watch. I didn't do it myself directly, but I should have, you know, somehow caught it or something like that. Yeah, people, so his idea was this would actually make you a better leader by doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, because though, like, I don't know, he had a
Well, there is
way of
something,
thinking that, you know, people, responsible people take responsibility, and then if you have, the more responsibility you have, the better person you'll be.
well, I think that the first one is correct. Responsible people take responsibility, that's what, and it's a habit, like you know, Aristotle's gonna say. There could be a limit beyond which you shouldn't take responsibility, Aristotle would say.
Yes.
You know, let's take for example, we talked about this early in the semester, student learning. We were talking about it before we began class. I have my part that I'm responsible for in your learning, right? And so I have to establish a syllabus, come to class prepared, give lectures, ask you guys questions, discuss things with you. You know, there's a whole list of things I have to do, right? There are things that you have to do as well, each one of you individually as a student in order for you to learn and in order for you to improve. And both of us have to be doing our jobs. If you're really bright, you can have a bad professor who comes to class unprepared every day and teaches, you know, about their cats rather than about the class. And you could still make progress because you would read the book and, you know, learn the stuff on your own. But that's not what most students do, is it? That's kind of rare. I mean, I'm not going to, you know, knock my professors too much, but when I was an undergrad, they didn't seem particularly engaged or prepared or anything like that. I probably learned more from the library than I did from some of my profs. But that was a failure somewhere along the line. So it could be that, you know, sometimes both things have to cooperate. Now, if I try to take responsibility, I've seen people do this, if I try to take responsibility for your actions as students, let's say you don't learn. Let's say only half of the class comes out of here actually knowing anything about Aristotle, even though we were going to talk about Aristotle for like 3 weeks, right? And there's all these resources. That's not my fault. So provided I've done my part, I'm responsible for a certain portion, then you're responsible for the other portion, right? And you guys, all of you who are in athletics, you can think about this too. Your coach is responsible for setting up all these exercises and things like that, but you actually have to go and do the drills and the practice, right? And if the coach sets up all these exercises and you don't do the drills, it's not exactly his fault. Of course, if he doesn't do anything, you may as well just go home and play around, right? I mean, if soccer practice is just kicking the ball around, no drills, no scrimmages, no, you know, studying anything, then what's the point in doing it? You could just do that in the park, right? Screw around on a Saturday afternoon. So there's responsibility. There is limits to how much responsibility that it's reasonable for a person to take. And there are some people who take way more responsibility than they want to, right? Let's look at, this is all very good prep. Let's look at what Aristotle says now about these things. Aristotle talks in terms of the voluntary and the involuntary. And the voluntary is that which we're responsible for, right? And the involuntary is that which we get off the hook. Involuntary. Sorry about that. Aristotle considers two main ways in which things become involuntary in this book. He talks about compulsion and he talks about ignorance. Now, how do we oppose that to what's voluntary? Well, compulsion or ignorance would be causes for why the thing turns out the way it does. Compulsion means something else is calling the shot, something else is making the agent do, the agent is the doer, making the agent do what they do. Right? With the voluntary, the source of the action is the lesser, the agent. The action originates from them. And you might say, well, that doesn't make any sense. You know, even if somebody acts in ignorance, the action originates from them. But in a certain sense, if they're acting in ignorance, it's because, you know, ignorance is a cause for the way things turn out. Now, a lot of people make a lot of claims about how far these get people off the hook. You notice Aristotle accepts some of them and he rejects some of the others. And why are we so interested in this? Well, there's two main reasons for ethics. One is ethics just in general, right? We want to know what people can actually be held responsible for. Sometimes this matters, say, in a court of law. Is somebody responsible for the thing that they did? If you can say that they were crazy, you get them off the hook, right? Not guilty by reason of insanity. A lot of people, you know, try to make insanity defenses, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. You've all probably watched lots of Law and Order, so you've seen this sort of thing, right? There's now, I guess, actually on cable somewhere, a Law and Order channel, where it's Law and Order all day long. Nothing but Law and Order. They have that many episodes of that show. Why else are we interested in this? Well, think about Aristotle, right? Aristotle's ethics is what kind of ethics? What do we place it under? It's not egoist. It's not contractarian. It's a
Virtuous?
Virtue ethics, yeah. So, virtue ethics makes virtue and vice absolutely central concepts. Virtue and vice, you remember, Aristotle said, there's a couple things that define it. A virtue is habitual, so it's not just something that you do once in a while, it's something that's part of your character. It's also chosen as such. A virtuous person chooses to do the right thing because it's the right thing, and they recognize that, not just because they're going to make money on it or because their friends tell them that's the thing to do. There's some sort of choice being made. So virtuous actions are in some way voluntary. Now, nobody has any problem taking credit for virtuous actions. It's when we get to, say, vicious actions that people want to say, well, you know, something else made me do it. So let's look at the things that Aristotle actually says about this. He says, since that which is done under compulsion or by reason of ignorance is involuntary, the voluntary would seem to be that of which the moving principle is the agent himself, he being aware of the particular circumstances of the action. Now he says something else that's really interesting here. Presumably acts done by reason of anger or appetite are not rightly called involuntary. But people do often say this, don't they? My desires compelled me to do this. I couldn't help myself. Or, you know, I was in a fit of rage and then therefore I acted this way. And all of you, hang on one second. All of you have been angry, right? All of you have been probably intensely angry at one point or another. You had a parent, a friend, sibling, somebody who bothered you. You know, you can think of the whole range of people we get angry at. People on TV sometimes you get angry at. They say, you know, stupid things. How many of you have done something that you regretted later because you were angry? Okay, all of you have got your hands up. How many of you actually felt like you couldn't do otherwise when you did that? At least once. Like you found yourself just sort of following along the course. That's what it is to be in the grips of anger. Think about these questions for a moment. Well, I'm going to put a few other things on the board. I'd like you to think about this one. What is a case where you were not responsible for your action or your response? And then write it down, because I'm going to ask you guys about this. We're going to use these as examples. We'll see whether they hold up according to Aristotle. What was a case where you did something? Let's make it something bad, right? Because everybody wants to take credit for good things. Where you did something that you know afterwards is bad, but you don't think you were responsible. And then think about a more generic type of case. It doesn't even have to be one you agree with. What's a type of case where we generally, in our society, don't hold people responsible for their actions? Generally. You can always find somebody who's going to say, that person did it and they're responsible. But as a society where we don't hold people responsible. So go ahead and write these down, and I'll sort of randomly ask people. I'm going to put a few things over here. Okay, so let's start with the second question. What are some cases where we don't hold people responsible? Yeah.
When they are under duress.
Okay, so that's like compulsion. Did any of you have anything like that when they're under duress? What do we think of like when we think of somebody being under duress? We say things like, when we're saying we're not under duress, it's not like anybody put a gun to your head, right? Now, what if somebody actually does put a gun to your head and takes you to the ATM and orders you to take out all of your money? In a certain sense, that's involuntary, isn't it? It gets really sticky when we get to things like, let's say I hold a gun to your head and tell you to push a button that's going to kill another person. You know, we get into a court of law, right? Those get really sticky. What else could place us under duress? What other sort of things did you guys have? Yeah.
There could be maybe like a social duress, like
Social pressure, yeah.
social pressure where, you like, oh, if I didn't do that, I was going to get fired, or if I didn't keep my mouth shut, I was going to get fired.
Okay, so
Like, let's
holding
say,
on to a job or, say, financial interests. Are there other social pressures that people bring to bear on each other? You guys all, went to high school. What was high school like? Best 4 years of your life, like they often say to you? It's not. I mean, college is better than high school. Grad school is better than college. Working is better than college too, actually. You'll see that. What other kinds of pressures? I mean, think about the way cliques work. If you don't do this, you can't be in this group of people. That sounds like compulsion, doesn't it? What else did people have? What did you have?
I said it's self-defense.
Self-defense, okay. We don't hold people responsible for hurting or killing an aggressor. Okay. Or sometimes even protecting other people. What did you have? Yeah. Yes.
I was thinking self-defense, but
is not always true.
Yeah, we're not concerned with just what the legal code is, because legal codes vary from country to country to country. We're exploring ethical issues here. Okay? Yeah.
Like, we don't really hold people responsible for something if they didn't have like a predisposed duty to do something. Like,
Oh, I see. So if it really wasn't their job to do, like for instance,
let's say
there was an accident out there on one of the on-ramps, off-ramps for getting off of the bridge onto 9 this morning, and there was, there was a truck and a car, and everyone was having to go around. You guys are all, familiar with this sort of thing. And I didn't stop, and as a matter of fact, instead, I, did what I was supposed to do and went around, and was tempted actually to, kind of curse the guys out because they caused a big traffic snarl, but I didn't. So that's a little minor victory for me. Now, was it my job to get out there and like direct traffic? Somebody should have. Is that my job? If somebody doesn't, there's going to be another accident there pretty soon. But it's not my job, nor is it your job. Might be some of your jobs. Those of you who are going into law enforcement later on, that would be your job. Right? So that, you're right. There could be some cases where it doesn't fit into the scheme at all because it's not our job. Let's think about a few other things. What about addiction? If somebody's addicted to a drug and they have an incredible craving for that drug, that sounds like desire or appetite. Do we in our society hold them responsible for what they do while they're trying to satisfy that desire for the drug? Sometimes we do. But often, a lot of people will say that they're not actually responsible. What about if somebody is actually in a state of ignorance because they're high or drunk? Now, Aristotle's not going to get them off the hook, yeah.
But it's still voluntary because you choose to do so. It's not like
You choose to have hallucinations if you take acid?
but you choose to take the drug.
Exactly. Now there's a distinction there. I'll get to you in just a second. There's a very important distinction there between choosing the current state that you're in and choosing what led up to that state. And Aristotle is going to focus on that. That's why a lot of things for Aristotle are actually going to be voluntary that in our society we often place in the category of involuntary.
Yeah, but one is aware of the effects by taking the drug, though. So if you decide to drive after drinking,
Yeah.
too bad, it is your fault.
Yeah, well, we do hold people responsible for DUI. Yeah. Now, we do notice, though, the penalties for some things if you're drunk. If you get in a bar fight and you kill somebody, but you were blind drunk, they might be more willing to entertain manslaughter charges than murder too. Might, because ethics is not a matter of know this absolutely. Yeah.
I was gonna say, sometimes we don't hold people responsible for lying, like, lying on the stand. My professor said he knew lots of police officers and even him that would lie on the stand and they weren't held responsible for it.
Oh. Yeah. So you're saying
what I'm
that
saying?
nothing was done about it?
Yeah,
Okay. Was it known that they lied on the stand?
yeah, I mean, my professor said it was. He probably knows.
It was known by the professor, right? But was it known by the general
Well, I
society?
mean,
'Cause-
he said that like the people in the courthouse or whatever probably
Yeah.
knew that he was lying, just to get this guy off.
Oh, okay. Because there are penalties if you get caught doing that, right? That's
Yeah.
perjury.
Yeah, that's what he said.
And there are cases where people go to prison not for the underlying charge,
Yeah.
but for lying on the stand about it. Like that was the case of Martha Stewart, right? She went to jail. No, she went to prison, didn't she? Did she go to
she
jail?
went to prison.
Yeah, I thought she went. Yeah, for perjury. Well, let's look at this now. So, what is ignorance like, or what is compulsion like? Let's look at what Aristotle says. says everything that's done by reason of ignorance is not involuntary. Only what produces pain and repentance, a feeling of, having done the wrong thing in the person who does it afterwards, is actually involuntary. The man who's done something owing to ignorance and doesn't feel any vexation has not acted voluntarily, nor involuntarily. It sort of fits in between. Now, like it says, acting by reason of ignorance seems to be different from acting in ignorance. Man who's drunk or in a rage is thought to act as a result not of ignorance. Ignorance is not the cause in that case, but in ignorance. He's temporarily, because of the state that he's in, unable to take in some information that he ought to be able to. And if we look a little bit further down in there, he talks about we do actually punish people for their ignorance if a person is thought responsible for their ignorance. So this would be like the case of the drug user who uses drugs and they do some horrible action under the influence of a drug. Let's think of hallucinogenics, right? Hallucinogenics make you see things that aren't there or make things that you actually are seeing look differently. So I take acid or mushrooms or peyote, and now I think you're a bunch of demons and I kill you all. Well, I'm responsible, Aristotle would say, because I chose to take the drug. Now, what do you think about it? What would he say about a case where, say, somebody just put a bunch of LSD into our water? Do you think he would consider us responsible for that? Yeah.
No, it wouldn't, because we didn't have a choice in taking the drug. We were.
Exactly, yeah. Then we would be acting in a state of ignorance that we have no responsibility for. So what's really going to be key for Aristotle is not just, is there a state of ignorance, but what led up to that state of ignorance? He also talks about another important type when he talks about vice or wickedness. He says, now every wicked man is ignorant of what he ought to do and what he ought to abstain from, and it's because of this that men become unjust and in general bad. But the term involuntary tends to be used not if a man is ignorant of what is to his advantage, but ignorance of particulars. And now the other thing to think about with this is, how do people actually become bad? For Aristotle, we saw this last class, it's through doing actions. So if you are over and over again in your life doing unjust actions, taking more than your fair share, maybe fighting people for it, or telling yourself that that's okay, sooner or later you will start to believe that, won't you? And you will screw up what we often call, metaphorically, your moral compass. Instead of pointing north, your moral compass will point east or south. And, there are some people who, because they've done bad things over and over again, become convinced that that's the right thing to do. That that's the normal thing to do. If that's the case, they're ignorant, aren't they? They're not ignorant of particulars, the sort of particulars that actually get you off the hook. They're ignorant in a bigger sense of what's actually right and wrong. But whose fault is that? I mean, this is an interesting question. Aristotle says it's entirely them, right? Well, yes and no. I mean, we're going to see when we get to book 7, there could be some exceptions to that. In our society, we hardly ever talk about that, though. How many of you have heard the term nature versus nurture? Well, all of you. Okay, good. So when we talk about a nature versus nurture debate, nature meaning somebody's genetics, nurture meaning their environment. And this comes up in sociology and in criminology and in psychology, all the human or social sciences. Why does it come up? Because we want to say, what makes people the way they are? Is it nature? Is it genetic predispositions, like our alcoholics because they have an alcoholic gene? Or is it nurture, their environment? Grandpa was an alcoholic, grandma was an alcoholic, mom and dad were, so therefore I'm going to turn out to be an alcoholic. We often look at it in terms of those two things. Now notice neither one of those has anything to do with what's voluntary, does it? Free will or choice is left completely out of the picture then, isn't it?
Like the whole nature theory kind of says that, you know, that part of you isn't voluntary because it's in your genetics.
Yeah,
But-
nature versus nurture
But
places everything on the side of the involuntary. Yeah,
But wouldn't nurture also be involuntary if that's what you were taught to do?
so just what I'm saying. Nature versus nurture, both sides of it are on the involuntary. So if your whole frame of understanding ethical issues is nature versus nurture, you've already left something big out because you've made everything involuntary then.
Then what's the point of debating it if they're both involuntary?
Oh, people will debate about all sorts of things, even if they, are wrong. You're going to find this throughout your college career. They're not actually saying that whether it's voluntary or involuntary. They're saying which kind of involuntary is it in that case. But there's also a notion of voluntariness with it, because if it's just nature, we can't do anything about it, can we? Other than maybe, modify somebody's DNA. If it's nurture, if it's environment, then that person can't do anything about it. But couldn't we affect their environment? Now, if we choose to affect their environment, our choices are actually voluntary. So this whole notion of nurture versus nature, it's very incomplete. What has to be in that, what has to be added to that is the voluntary, the whole sphere of where we actually choose to do things. Yeah.
I was gonna say, people, like, nature, you don't have control of your genetics, but nurture, you have control over your environment. You can
Okay,
make the voluntary choice to say, okay, you know what, I'm going to hang out with a different social group, or I'm
Yes.
going to get a different job.
You're right. At a certain point. I mean, when you were a kid, you didn't choose what sort of household you were in, but part of the process of becoming an adolescent and then an adult is actually things like choosing your peer group. Although, again, you don't have absolute control over that. What were you going to say? Something similar?
I was just gonna say I agree with what he said, but you can really control your environment. Sometimes it depends on the opportunity you have.
Yes, you're right. You're going to find, we're going to get into this a little bit later, a lot of ethics is what you make of imperfect situations over and over and over again. Well, let's go on with ignorance. So when could ignorance actually get us off the hook? Aristotle lays down some particular circumstances that we might be ignorant of. And he says, a man might be ignorant of who he is, what he's doing, what or whom he's acting on, sometimes also what he's doing it with, and to what end, and how he's doing it. And he says nobody could actually be ignorant of all these unless he's crazy. It's very rare when a person is actually ignorant of who they are, but it does happen. So he wants to be very, exhaustive, so he puts it in there. But let's think about some of these other ones. Of what he's doing, a man might be ignorant. As, for instance, when people say it slipped out of their mouths as they were speaking, or they did not know it was a secret. There can be certain actions that when we do them, we think we're doing one thing, but because of the circumstances that we're in, we don't realize it, we're actually doing something else as well. So I think that I am just driving my car at night, and it turns out that I didn't realize it, but I was running over all sorts of possums. Now, I may not have intended that. That may not have been the description that I give of my action, but that could be the result of it, right? So that would be what the action is. I merely intended to give constructive criticism, but in the process, I destroyed somebody's self-esteem. Acting in ignorance. Didn't realize that the person was so fragile. I didn't realize that their parents had both died in a terrible car crash the night before. And that, my criticizing their paper was going to send them over the edge. That would be acting in by reason of ignorance, a reason you couldn't be, you couldn't know all the particulars. What else? He gives you some examples like, you might think that your son was an enemy. People get mixed up about all these sorts of things. They think that their friends are, trying to steal their boyfriend or girlfriend, or are out to get them. People get paranoid about these sort of things sometimes. A pointed spear had a button on it. What do they mean by a button? They mean it was blunt, right? In old days, people used to practice martial arts with real weapons. They were just blunt. I used to fence, actually, and fencing is, fighting with swords that are not quite like real swords, but they hurt like hell when you get hit with them. And if you took the tip off of it, you could kill somebody with one of those pretty easily. Do you think people actually set about to do that deliberately? No. Well, maybe some, who knows. But most people don't. But accidents happen, right? I was running with the scissors. I didn't realize they were so sharp until I ran into somebody. That's not something that really happened, by the way. Just an example. But it's an example that fits this. You might give a man a draught, a drink of water to save him, but actually kill him. You might want to touch a man, as people do in sparring. Again, he's using a martial arts example, and actually hurt him. So you might not be aware of just how strong you are. There's a lot of possibilities where you would be ignorant of some sort of particular of the action, and then it would be involuntary, wouldn't it? Provided you're not the cause of that ignorance. Let's look now at compulsion. It says, what act should be called compulsory? We answer that without qualification, actions are so when the cause is in the external circumstances and not in the agent. In things that are in themselves involuntary, but now and in return for these gains are worthy of choice, and whose moving principles in the agent are in themselves involuntary. So in one way they're involuntary, but in return for the gains are voluntary. So if you do something for money, well, like to hold on to your job, right? If you don't make sure that my shoes are shined every day, then I'm going to fire you. In one sense, you shining my shoes is involuntary. You're doing it under duress, as we say. But you still have a choice. You just happen to prefer keeping your job more than not shining shoes. You could even say that with the ATM and the person with the gun to your head example, although that's a lot harder of a choice. And Aristotle says something really interesting. He says there's certain limits that beyond which we don't hold people responsible for. I think a gun to your head is probably one of those limits. Or, how else do we put people under duress? We can torture them. Right? People do that. To give up information. Torture isn't really that effective because people will say all sorts of things under torture, whether they're true or not, just to get the torture to end. There's all sorts of ways to put people under duress. Now, where else does this become an issue? It's pretty rare that somebody is the cause of somebody else using compulsion on them. It's pretty common that somebody is the cause of their own ignorance, though, isn't it? So that would, if you're the cause of that, if the chain goes like this, agent, ignorance, then the agent acting in ignorance, the agent is responsible. That's voluntary. So if you get yourself drunk, and you do something, you are ignorant of what you're doing, but you chose to get drunk. If you, hey, one second. If you have a vicious character and you have your moral compass mixed up, it's to some degree because you've developed that. Now Aristotle asks something else. If that's the case, can't we just fix it right away? It was towards the end of that section in Book 3, before he starts talking about the particular virtues. So there's good news and bad news about this. The good news is, when it comes to virtues, once you've actually established a virtue, you're sort of on a trajectory. You have inertia. You're going to keep doing that. You're going to keep doing the right thing at the right time for the right reason. Bad news is, once you do that with vice, you're going to keep going on that same trajectory too. It's not easy to change it. You have to make a deliberate effort to break one habit and replace it with another habit. So if you are, for instance, let's take a very common example in our society. You know, there's a huge obesity epidemic in our society. They call it an epidemic. You know, it's not quite the same thing as a disease, but it is actually a problem. It's got economic effects. It's leading to all sorts of changes in things. It's a big problem, especially for the younger kids. Why do people eat too much? That's a question where you can ask whether it's voluntary or involuntary. Right? When people overeat, it could be because they have an insatiable compulsion and they just can't stop eating. That's pretty rare. It's more often because they're what Aristotle calls self-indulgent. That they are the opposite of, they're the opposite of temperate. Temperance is the virtue that has to do with how we regulate, we talked about this with Plato, how we regulate our bodily pleasures. Eating and drinking are bodily pleasures, right? You want to take the right amount at the right time for the right reason. If you're eating all the time and you're eating more than you ought to, that's a problem. That's actually a vice. The person who does that, they actually quite often think that that's the right amount for them. They become ignorant of what their good actually is. You know, think about a real easy example. Should you eat before you go to bed? What do you know from your health classes? Why is it a bad idea to eat before you go to bed, other than it might give you bad dreams?
Your metabolism slows before you go when you're sleeping.
Yeah, and so if you eat what do we eat before we go to bed? You know, it's usually a midnight snack, and is it going to be something healthy, like a salad? People say, I'm going to make myself a salad before I go to bed. Well, they're watching TV and they eat some popcorn or chips or, wash it down with a soda. You're not going to burn those calories off while you're sleeping, right? So is it a good move for you to do that? People, over and over again, lose sight of that. I mean, if you actually pointed it out to them and said, you probably shouldn't do that, maybe they wouldn't be in ignorance. Why are they in ignorance? It's because of the vice. It's because they've been, moving along that way. You can't just tell yourself, okay, I'm going to change like that. I'm going to quit being vicious and start being virtuous. It has to change action after action after action after action. How do you change it when it comes to eating? One meal at a time. One snack at a time. You go to the cafeteria, and instead of getting, a really big portion, you get a smaller portion. You do that often enough, you'll become temperate. You do the opposite often enough, you will become self-indulgent, Aristotle says. What are you going to say, Mr. Burns?
But people who are fat aren't always, it's not always their fault. It's not always eating too much. Some
yes, you're right.
There have actual problems with health, medical issues.
There are, you're correct about that. Although the majority of people who are overweight in our society, and Western society in general, is because of overeating. So there are, yeah, you're right. There's some people who have, hormone imbalances or things like that, but it's much less common than what we're talking about here. That Aristotle actually has something to do with it. Aristotle would say, if you have some sort of bodily imbalance, that's not voluntary, is it? You don't have any control over it. You would have control over whether you take your medicine, whether you go to the doctor, in our society, I suppose. The last thing that I want to hit on is what he calls moral choice and deliberation. This is going to take us one step further. So, up to this point we've been talking about what's voluntary and what's involuntary. Now there's a class of the voluntary that has to do with what he calls moral choice. So here is the realm of voluntary actions. Sometimes it's translated as deliberate choice. Sometimes it's just translated as choice. Like I put in your iLearn thing, it's actually translating a Greek term that's a bit difficult to translate well. Proairesis, which means literally preference or selection or choosing, but it has a sort of habitual, done over and over again kind of connotation to it. So your proairesis is responsible for the character that you have. In a large sense, your proairesis is that whole battery of your dispositions and habits that you've developed. It's what you are. It's what I am. Yeah.
So when you're talking about choice, are you talking about a conscious choice or an unconscious one based on habit?
Well, it can become unconscious based on habit later on, but you know, it's our conscious choices that actually do establish habits. And all moral choice is voluntary. Not everything voluntary is necessarily moral choice. Right? So, moral choice is that sphere that we actually have control over. And we deliberate. Now, you probably don't use this term for describing what it is that you actually do when you're faced with a bunch of choices. You don't say, I'm going to go and deliberate. You say things like, I'm going to go sleep on that. I'm going to go talk to some friends. I need to think this over. When you're thinking something over, what you're doing, Aristotle says, is you're actually like laying out the different possibilities and seeing, you know, which ones would actually satisfy your interests, your desires, your, as he calls it, ends the most. Deliberation is how we get to our ends, our goals, the things that we want the most. So when you're in a situation, your ends can change too from time to time. You know, it's going to depend on the situation. So your end as you go out on a Saturday night may be to not be lonely, or to find a sexual partner, or to have a good time. These are three possible ends, right? That all could fit within the matrix of going out on Saturday night. And there are certain things that will be means for that end, right? And they may be connected in a whole chain. And everything that you do, your whole life, everything that everybody else does, they've got some ends, they've got some goals in mind, right? You could have multiple ends, you usually do. Now when you actually have to sit down and think about things, make moral choices, you're not deciding which ends you want to pursue. You've already got an end in mind. You're trying to figure out which means are the best means to get yourself there. Do the means interfere with other things that are important for you? You know, like what's something that's important, you think, for all of you as students? You all want to graduate, right? So you'll do what it takes to graduate. I hope, right? Anybody who won't do what it takes to graduate? All of you are on the path to graduation. You have to think about what you're going to do. Let's take a non-moral choice. What classes are you going to take? Should you take just the classes that you find most interesting by their descriptions? Is that a recipe for graduating? You guys have advisors, right? Have any of you ever gone into your advisor and you say, all right, here's what I want to take. This class, and this class. And your advisor says, well, you can have one of those, but you have to take this and this and this semester instead. So you're nodding heads. Why do they do that?
So you should graduate someone on time.
Yeah, because if you chose the means that you want, maybe you won't graduate on time. If you stop and smell the academic flowers, maybe you'll have to stay an extra semester. That might actually be a good thing. You could actually deliberate with yourself. Maybe I do want to stay an extra semester so I can take some more classes. But now you have a different end in mind, don't you? Now you're deciding whether graduating on time will actually fulfill deeper desires that you have. And oftentimes as you think about this sort of stuff, or you talk it over with other people, you will uncover what it is that you care about more. This happens in relationships too. You get into an argument with your significant other. What do you generally want to do in an argument besides shop? That can be fun. Some people like breaking things too, throwing things around. Yeah.
I want to prove a point.
You want to prove a point, right? And the reason why you're having an argument is the other person. How do they feel about your point?
They don't like it.
They don't like it. They don't agree with it. They have their own point that they usually directly opposed to your point that they are trying to prove as well. Have you ever stopped in the middle of an argument and thought about what you were actually doing? Yeah. Yes? What sort of thoughts go through your head then?
Maybe he or she is right.
Yeah, it could be that you're mistaken about things. It's possible to put it in a bigger picture and say, should I really be yelling at the person that I supposedly care about? Do I really want to behave this way? Is this the pattern that I want to have with this person who maybe I'll be together with for the rest of my life? If you're doing that, what you're doing is you're actually reconsidering. You're trying to find what your ultimate end is. And then you're thinking, these means aren't really good means. I better find some other means to attain that end, like maybe entertaining whether they could be correct or not. If what really matters to you is winning, you're not going to entertain whether they could be correct, right? They're not correct because you're correct, and that's it. If you care about the person, and you care about your relationship with the person, or you even have, maybe you don't actually care about the person, maybe you just care about you actually not feeling like you're correct, but actually being correct, maybe then a necessary means to that is actually listening to the other person. You notice that if you have different ends, you're going to select different means. Somebody had their hand up over here.
I did, but I was basically going to say that, maybe when you're arguing, maybe you might stop and think that, maybe it's not really important that they feel the same way I do. But then you change your ends kind of by saying, all right, I don't need to convince this person that I'm right.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that could be changing the means along the way, thinking, do I really need... See, we often get mistaken. We have an end in mind and we say, I have to have this means or else I can't have that end. We don't often realize that there could be multiple ways to get to the same goal, right? There's a few other things that Aristotle says that I want to hit on. He says, do we deliberate about everything? No, we don't deliberate about everything. What don't we deliberate about? Well, we don't deliberate about things that are not in our power. Do we deliberate about what the Chinese Prime Minister is going to do? We might deliberate about, what we're trying to predict it if we're Chinese pundits, but for the most part, no, we don't. That's not within our power. That's not in our scope. Do we deliberate about whether corn grows best if you put herbicide on the seed, or whether you spray it on the fields, or whether you do organic gardening? That's not actually deliberation. That's not figuring out what the ends are. That's discussions about natural science. Deliberation, like he says, is about things that are in our power and can be done, that we actually have some choice about. It's concerned with things that happen in a certain way for the most part, but in which the event is obscure and with things in which it is indeterminate. Ethics is not about things being perfectly definable. The reason why we study ethics is to deal with all these sorts of cases where originally we talk about it being a gray area, to try to disentangle some of the black and some of the white out of it. Even after we do that, though, we're not left with a perfect distinction between them. There are still going to be some cases where you could deliberate several different ways and get to the same end. Now, what's very important here, what connects us all together, this has to do with our character. This is a process of practical reasoning, right? So let me actually write this down. This is, deliberation is practical reasoning. Here is where our character lies. If we practically reason well, our character will improve over time, because as we do good things, we become better people. As we do just actions, which, we do just actions because we realize that's the right thing to do. That is what will actually satisfy the ends that we have. If we do temperate actions, if we do courageous actions, we will become temperate and courageous. So the ways in which not just we do things, but the ways in which we think about things, and what we accept from other people with their thinking about things, that's going to affect our character. Likewise, once you actually establish a character, that will lead to certain modes of practical reasoning. The unjust person, why do you have to watch out for them? Because they are going to practically reason in such a way as to screw you over and screw over everybody else if they can. That's what it means to be unjust, that they have a disposition to doing that kind of thing. The coward, that you bring along with you to watch your back, whether it's in a fight situation, or going into a difficult negotiation, or dealing with somebody that you don't like to talk to, but you have to, their character is going to lead them to practically reason in such a way as to let you down. So these are very important. These are interrelated. The way in which we think about things, the way we practically reason. You guys are doing this all the time. And your character are interconnected. Yeah.
I was going to say, aside from habits, so I think most of the reason why people put things into a gray area,
Yeah.
because a lot of our decisions are time sensitive, and at that time, maybe we don't develop the habit or skill, maybe we're not put in the situation enough, we make the wrong decision sometimes.
Yeah.
I don't think you really, it's kind of voluntary, but it's also kind of an involuntary thing as well, because later on you're thinking, okay, if I had more time to think about it, I would have done something different.
You're right, yeah. I mean, that could be acting in ignorance of the particulars, right? And you're right, ethics is about making decisions within concrete situations in which we never have perfect knowledge. They don't often look like our textbook cases.
And a lot of times we don't have the time to really fully think through it.
That's why habit is so important, though. You lay down for yourself what the future is going to look like for you with the decisions that you're making now. So if you want to be a just person when you actually run into sticky ethical situations where you're going to have to make decisions and you're not going to have full knowledge and there's going to be pressures to bear, you have to start doing just actions now, according to Aristotle, so that you will be able to practically reason well when you get to that. It's not enough just to have book knowledge about this. You actually have to practice it. Same thing with courage. If you're going to read Aristotle's Nichomachean ethics and look at his definition of courage, and think that that's going to get you through a scary situation. When you get into the scary situation, even if you have it like written down on your hand, courage is the right amount of fear and confidence. By the time you actually look at that, you know, whatever scary thing is happening, and you're either going to stand up to it or not. That's why habits are really, really essential. But we have to choose our habits. If we just allow ourselves to be kind of pushed around by our society, or whatever other determinants are taking place, we're probably not going to turn out to have good character. Good character requires you to make some choices. It probably requires you to make some sacrifices too along the way. It's not something easy to do. So that's where we'll leave off. It's a good point. Next class, what are we going to do? We're going to look at particular virtues and vices, one by one. What do they actually involve? What do they entail? I've got a few handouts up for you about some of them, like temperance and liberality and magnificence. I'm going to try to put the one up for anger later today, or maybe the one for justice. Yeah.